I wanted someone to share that passion with, to enjoy it together, you know? And I also found that at a certain point few living filmmakers embody the spirit of cinema quite like Martin Scorsese. At 82 he remains both student and master. Still watching, still learning, still urging the world to protect its film heritage. From the raw intensity of Mean Streets to the epic sweep of Killers of the Flower Moon, his stories have reshaped how generations experience the screen. Yet, long before the Oscars and accolades, Scorsese was a frail boy in Little Italy, glued to a small television, discovering the films that would define his life. Those early screenings, often foreign, subtitled, imperfectly dubbed, taught him that cinema could be truth, not just entertainment. Over the decades, he has spoken with reverence about films that have shaped him. Films about faith, obsession, history, and even humanity. Today, we count down 7 films that Scorsese has picked out as his favorite, which reflect not just his taste, but his soul. Number 7, Bicycle Thieves, 1948. The Italian classic that shaped his soul before Martin Scorsese became one of the world's most respected directors. He was a quiet boy in New York's Little Italy, often kept indoors by asthma. While kids played outside, he stayed mesmerized by the glow of a television flickering with films across the ocean. Among them was Victoria De Sica's small black and white masterpiece from post-war Italy, Bicycle Thieves. Scorsese first saw it in the late 1940s, long before he knew terms like neo-realism or cinematic movement. What he felt was recognition. The story of a poor man and his son combing Rome streets in search of a stolen bicycle. The father's only way of maintaining a job had no glamorized stars, no polished sets, just ordinary faces filled with struggle and dignity. Growing up in a family of working-class Sicilian immigrants, Scorsese saw his own relatives on screen. He would later say films like Bicycle Thieves were more than cinema. They were truth. They meant more to him emotionally and psychologically than anything else. De Sica's compassion for ordinary people taught Scorsese that drama could live in the smallest details. A glance, a silence, a man's pride crumbling under poverty. When he made Mean Streets decades later with hustlers, priests, and dreamers, he was tapping into the same human honesty. He wasn't filming movie characters. He was filming life. But it was the ending that got him. After a desperate search, the father, humiliated and out of options, tries to steal another man's bike in front of his son. Caught and shamed, he breaks down. The boy takes his hand as they walk away into a sea of strangers. That wordless gesture of forgiveness haunted Scorsese for years. It's not just about losing a bicycle, he reflected. It's about losing hope and still going on. That blend of despair and endurance echoes through his career from Taxi Driver to Raging Bull to Silence. In every broken soul he filmed, there's a trace of that father and son walking home through Rome. Technically, Bicycle Thieves showed what filmmaking could do with almost nothing. Shot on location with non-professional actors, it made the city itself a character, something Scorsese would later replicate on New York streets. Proved authenticity could be more powerful than spectacle. This film is why I make movies, he admitted. It showed me that the small things, a look, a gesture, a silence could be everything. For Scorsese, Bicycle Thieves remains a touchstone, a reminder that cinema's greatest strength lies not in grandeur, but in honesty. Through Dica, he learned that the truest art comes from compassion, and that even in defeat, humanity endures. Have films from other cultures ever made you see your own life differently? Which international movie has moved you the most? Number 6, Citizen Kane, 1941. The masterpiece that redefined cinema forever. When Martin Scorsese first saw Citizen Kane, he was already obsessed with film mechanics. How light hit the frame, how a camera moved through a room. But Orson Welles' debut didn't just impress him. It stunned him. It made him realize cinema could reinvent itself in a single stroke. Orson Welles wiped the slate clean. Scorsese once said, "It's the greatest risk-taking of all time in film. Even today, its photography and narrative techniques still shock audiences." For Scorsese, Citizen Kane wasn't just a classic. It was a revolution. It was released in 1941, and it told the life of newspaper tycoon Charles Foster Kane through fractured memories, flashbacks, and shifting perspectives. While most movies were going along straight lines, shattered chronology and built an emotional puzzle instead. Scorsese saw in it a boldness he would later emulate, the courage to experiment, to challenge the rules of storytelling. The young filmmaker at NYU watched Kane again and again, studying the ways Wells used shadows for depth. How deep focused cinematography made every inch of the screen alive. The work of cinematographer Greg Toland became a kind of Bible to scores who later partnered with Michael Ballhaus and Rodrigo Prieto to challenge convention in his own films. He once joked that Kane taught him more about directing than film school ever could. It wasn't about tricks. It was about vision. But it wasn't technical perfection that mostly intrigued Scorsese. It was the tragedy. A story of Kane, a man who gets everything and ends up with nothing, was incredibly human. Behind the greatness of mansions and headlines, Scorsese saw loneliness, a man surrounded by power crushed by isolation. That theme of moral emptiness echoes through his own work. From The Wolf of Wall Street to Raging Bull, both directors understood the same truth. Success without soul leads only to ruin. Scorsese also admired Wells himself, the 25-year-old who defied studios, fought executives, and created a masterpiece that nearly cost him his career. That defiance inspired Scorsese decades later when he battled censors over The Last Temptation of Christ and financiers over silence. To him, Citizen Kane was a reminder that real art demands sacrifice. Wells risked everything, Scorsese reflected, and gave us a new language for film. To this day, Kane remains a benchmark. When he teaches young directors or introduces films through his projects on preservation, he points back to it, to that energy of reinvention. He says Kane can still feel fresh because true innovation never ages. That's why 80 years later, the whisper of Rosebud still lingers, not as a mystery, but as a warning. Do you think Citizen Kane is rightly considered one of the greatest films ever made? Why do you think its story still resonates after over 80 years? Number 5, 8½, 1963. The film that taught him to dream through doubt. When Martin Scorsese speaks of Federico Fellini's 8½, his tone softens. It's the voice of a pilgrim recalling a sacred place. Fellini's semi-autobiographical masterpiece struck him not just as a movie but as a confession, an artist exposing his own confusion and wonder. Scorsese is called 8½, the purest expression of love for the cinema that I know, that says it all to him. Fellini didn't make a film. He made a mirror in which every director sees himself. It tells the story of Guido Anelmi, a filmmaker who has run out of ideas. Hounded by producers, lovers, priests, and memories, he drifts between fantasy and reality while attempting to come up with his next movie. When Scorsese saw it first in the early 60s, he was a young student wrestling with the same question. What kind of artist do I want to be? Fellini's response that imagination and truth are not mutually exclusive was a liberating one. That opening traffic jam dream as Guido escapes his car and floats into the sky proved that cinema could shift from physical to spiritual on a single cut. Technically, 8½, was an epiphany. Fluid Cameron Inoa's whirling score, light and shadow in harmony, everything indicating film wasn't simply a matter of craft but rhythm, almost music. Scorsese studied how Fellini choreographed chaos, filling frames with faces and laughter, smoke and motion while keeping each emotion exactly calibrated. That orchestration would echo later in his own sprawling ensembles, from Goodfellas to The Irishman, in which the crowd is distilled into one connected heartbeat. But beyond style, 8½, spoke to him spiritually. Guido's creative paralysis mirrored Scorsese's own anxieties about faith and purpose. Raised Catholic, he often felt torn between sacred duty and artistic obsession. Watching Guido stumble through self-doubt and temptation, he recognized that conflict. Fellini gave me permission to be personal, he later said. He showed me that confusion and doubt could themselves be the subject of art. It's no coincidence that Raging Bull and Silence explore men trapped between guilt and grace, descendants of Guido's restless soul. Scorsese also adored how Fellini made filmmaking myth. Guido's half-built spaceship and endless rehearsals are a metaphor for the human mind. Unfinished, chaotic, but reaching toward transcendence. For Scorsese, that was cinema's ultimate truth. It's never done. It's always looking. He suggests that young directors watch 8.5 when they lose confidence. Every artist hits that wall, he says. Fellini showed us how to climb it with imagination. Even now, Scorsese turns back to 8.5 for reassurance. A reminder that creation is not about certainty, but about surrender. He had once joked that every time he stepped onto a set, Guido's ghost whispered, "Just start. Something beautiful will happen for him." Fellini's dreamlike odyssey functions as both caution and blessing, since art is pain, chaos, and ecstasy all in one long take. Have you ever felt as creatively stuck as Guido in 8.5? What helps you break through when inspiration has disappeared?